good afternoon and good evening. I'm Elias Brenis from the University of Melbourne. And so we are delighted to initiate a new series of webinars, which we call the Econ-Omics Talk. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see the screen now? We're delighted about this new sort of series of webinars because it will give us the opportunity to invite experts in the field and hear on a topic of interest to our members. And it will also give us the opportunity to ask them some career-related questions and sort of provide learnings that will be relevant to all of us. I just want to acknowledge that this webinar series and all the activities that the SIG does would not be possible without this amazing group of researchers that come together often at difficult sort of times and sort of help us connect and build capacity in the discipline. We want more conveners to join our SIG, so if you're interested to join our convener group, please send us an email to iheargenomics@gmail.com. So the way this sort of series of economics talks will work is that sort of the host initially will welcome the group and sort of present a bio of the presenter, and then we will have some sort of career-related questions. Then we will hand over to the presenter, and then we're going to follow at the end of the talk with some research-related Q&A. We are happy to see sort of questions at the Zoom, and sort of the facilitator will sort of facilitate that discussion. But we also sort of would like to do is sort of initiate some discussion as well online. So if you haven't followed us on Twitter, so please do. This is the economics sort of link. And also, the hashtag with economics talks, if you want sort of to initiate some discussion or some questions about today's sort of talk. So let's build some momentum. So for the first economics talk, we are delighted to host Deborah Marshall. And we will hear about bringing the patient voice and values into precision health economics to inform patient-centered care and decision-making. So Deborah is a professor of health economics within the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary in Canada. She holds multiple leadership positions, and she's a founding member of the International Academy for Health Preferences Research. She was the past president of the board of directors at the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcome Research. And she has led multiple task force reports on preference elicitation and simulation modeling that represent gold standard practice in our discipline. I had the pleasure of working with Deborah as part of a white paper led from the World Economic Forum, which was on global data access for solving rare diseases. So I know firsthand the quality and rigor that she brings in her work. So no doubt she has won multiple awards and she's a fantastic speaker. Deborah, before I hand over to you for your talk, we have prepared some questions for you that we would like to ask you. So the first question we would like to ask you is, what was one of the most impactful decisions that you've made that helped shape your career?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. Really thrilled to be here today. And I realized as we were coming on here, it's also the inaugural Econ-Omics talk. So I'm thrilled to do this. It's also really fun. I like this format. And thank you for Elias and Deirdre and James for coming up with this, because it's kind of nice to chat and reflect. And so I'm happy to chat a little bit about career ideas. And I think in terms of one of the most important decisions that helped shape my career, I have multiple answers to that. Sorry, it's not a simple, the most important. So naturally, I'm disregarding the instructions of the question. But I think there were several. One is that I made a decision, which was a non-decision at the time, to work in multiple settings. And the reason why I say it was a non-decision is I was footloose and fancy-free, as early career researchers often are. And I was really happy that I just probably made a very made uninformed and decisions that probably weren't very rational at the time, because opportunity presented itself, and I pursued those opportunities, even though I didn't really have a lot of clarity around what it meant. And so for me, that was, I've moved a fair bit early in my career, but I had the opportunity to work in a health technology assessment context, both in Canada and in Sweden. I did my training in the US for my doctoral degree, which was probably irrational because I didn't even have a site visit. I mean, I just went. It was kind of interesting. And then I worked for industry. And again, I was recruited. There was no sort of application process. I didn't directly do so, but I was recruited and solicited for the job. And I said, oh, well, that sounds interesting. And I did that. And then I was recruited back to Canada. And as I said, none of those were deliberately planned. But because again, I was footloose and fancy free, I had those opportunities, and I draw on that experience constantly in my career and in what I do, because I have these different lenses, because I've worked in different settings. So I don't, I have a little bit maybe different ways of looking at things, which maybe is why I can follow the health economics mantra very well. On one hand, you could look at it this way. On the other hand, you could look at it this way. But I think I value that. At any rate, the second thing I think I would say is the decision, which again really wasn't a decision. It happened to me at rounds, and I remember this moment. And what happened to me was talking to a colleague at rounds in my department here at Community Health Sciences, explaining to her the problem I was having with my health economics quantitative research. And she said, she's an older, more senior faculty member, and she looked at me, well, my dear, she said, you really need to engage patients in this discussion. And that was the start of launching the Patient and Community Engagement Research Program here in Calgary, which is, gosh, almost 8, 9, 10 years ago. We wrote a grant on patient engagement in research, and we since established the Patient Engagement Community Research Program in Calgary, and we have a certificate program that consists of 3 courses that is endorsed by the university. And that has completely changed how I do my research. So.
Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate. I mean, I really understand sort of the importance of range of experiences and sort of the patient and public engagement in the research. Now, thank you for pointing those out. Probably one more question. So we have questions also at the end. So, reflecting upon your career, what advice would you give to our early career researchers to help them grow into independent and impactful researchers?
Yeah, this comes up a lot, this kind of discussion, because one of the hats I wear, I guess all of us wear lots of different hats, but one of the hats I wear that you might not be aware of is as the principal investigator for something called here the Health System Impact Fellowship Program. So it's a national program in Canada, and it's about postdoctoral fellows mostly. We also have a PhD stream. But this comes up a lot because what it's oriented towards is developing competencies along a core framework. And it's really about embedded research. So creating the skills and the talents amongst our early career researchers to not only do high quality research, but also embed it into health systems and apply the research. So I love this program, and this discussion about what would be your advice comes up a fair bit. And I think we keep coming back to some version of networking. So things like this, forums like this and networking is really important to see what's out there, to see who's doing what, to connect with people. Having been in both the virtual world and the in-person world, I do think there's value to connecting to people in person as a sidebar. It doesn't have to be all the time, but connecting in person is good. And then I think the other thing which reflects my first comments is to be open to opportunities. I think don't be fixated on a specific career path that you have to do A, B, C, and D in that order. I don't think that's true. And I think these days there's so many opportunities with technology and different kinds of roles. I think you can define roles that suit your interests. To me, the most important thing about a job is that old saying, if you like your work, then it's not work. You have to like what you do. So I think that to me is probably the most important thing. And the third comment I'll make is find a mentor and find someone outside of your organization. I think particularly in academic organizations, it's a very tight group. And I think it's important to have someone outside of your immediate realm who can give you some honest advice, criticism, thoughts, or basically get you to reflect on what's important to you and where you want to go and how you might get there, and bring fresh ideas to your viewpoints.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. And just to also touch on this mentorship that you mentioned, sort of our CX sort of supports mentorship and also visiting opportunities. So if any of our members attending the course or seeing the talk afterwards would like sort of to initiate some mentorship, we have a scheme supported by here where sort of we have mentors and mentees that then we connect them, we bring them together to support the research. So please reach out to us for this. The other sort of thing, Deborah, is sort of, I've seen our staff sort of really flying once they have understood the clinical context they're working on, because we sort of very sort of focused on sort of the methods really. But the progress also depends on how well they have understood the context and then apply the methods in that context. So in the context of genomics, what sort of challenges do you think they need to face to grow?
Yeah, well, actually, Elias, I think you said a key one. One of the things that I highly emphasize on our team is that we're sort of the master of all trade, or what do you say, jack of all trades, master of none, in some ways, because yes, we have skill sets with health economics, but you cannot do anything in health economics without having clinical, very close, I would say, clinical colleagues whom you can discuss, read, engage, get and interpret data and information with. It just doesn't work. Yeah, you can read, and everybody's smart. They're all well educated, etc. But it's a very different thing to be able to have a honest discussion with a clinical colleague who can help you understand what the relevant questions are, and also how to interpret it in context. And even, well, you guys are all smarter than I am, but you can't know all the clinical areas and know the health economics areas and, purport to manage all of those different things. I would say it's parallel with patients. It's the same thing. You need people with lived experience to be able to help you understand how to apply, how to shape those research questions. And I would argue that really, I think, brings some depth and understanding into the research. So,
Thank you, Deborah. I really enjoyed that chat. So I will hand over to you now for the talk. We really look forward to hear and learn more about this topic.
excellent. Okay, so first technical challenge, we're going to see if this is going to work. Do you see the right screen?
Yes, we do. Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm happy to chat. As those of you know who know me, I can chat for a long time. So I'll just try to go through these relatively quickly, but also happy to have questions as we go along. If you want to address something, that's not a problem for me. I will ask Deirdre and Elias though to watch the chat because I cannot see that, as you well know, as you're presenting. So. Let me just walk you through this, but what I wanted to do is just give some examples about bringing patient voice and values into research, and obviously specifically applied in precision health or genomics or next generation sequencing kinds of things. So this is one of my favorite topics because it cuts across all of our research areas. But what I wanted to do is really think about the benefits of incorporating patient values into research. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through this. Obviously, we've got a mix of people on the webinar here. So forgive me if some of this is a little bit old hat for you, but I recognize some experts in patient preferences on our call here, and maybe some who are not so familiar. So I'll just try to go through quickly, but hopefully I'll hit the right balance in terms of what is of interest to you and the level of depth. But then the other thing I'm hoping that we can do is just to make sure people have a little bit of familiarity by the end of this with the different kinds of approaches and strategies of how you can explicitly measure patient values using quantitative methods for preferences, all with the goal of trying to make care more patient-centered. So one of the things we've done, and I should mention that James, Elias, and Deirdre and I are all geeks. And that's not meant to be an insult. It stands for something like Global Economics Evaluation of Genomics. I probably got that wrong because it's an odd acronym, but that's what it is. But the point is that we all share a common interest in economic evaluation of next generation sequencing and precision medicine. So one of the things that we've done in the past is we've done some shared papers addressing some of these critical issues. And one of the challenges papers that we did was looking at how do you assess value specifically in precision medicine. And I only highlight 2 points, but we do have a paper talking about the challenges and solutions. But 2 points I wanted to highlight here is that when you do precision health and you're doing testing, you basically get multiple actionable and non-actionable results that have potential downstream implications, both for the families of patients and the patients themselves, of course. And so that makes the decision problem a little more complex than sometimes it is in non-precision health, personalized health context. So the other big point here, and there are others if you look at this paper, but I just highlight these 2, is that precision medicine is associated with health, non-health, and process type outcomes. And this is precisely why preferences types of research methods become particularly relevant in precision health. So I'm going to use a few examples, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of a context here. But our research program here at the University of Calgary is quite national and international, actually, and is really around building capacity of patients engaged in research, and try to co-design and co-generate research that does improve outcomes. I hope he has that overall very high level kind of goal in their research. But I just wanted to explicitly say that because preferences in some way, shape, or form is pretty much interwoven through all of our research programs. So if I just look at this little map, I'm going to talk a little bit about our Can Do, and Cure program, which is essentially a childhood arthritis precision health program here funded by Genome Canada, Genome Alberta, Ontario Genomics, and CIHR. as well as Zonenve, because this is an international program with the Netherlands. The other is Care for Rare, which is a program that's been going on for a decade now. The current iteration of this is something called Solve, which is looking at optimizing the delivery of clinical genome-wide sequencing in rare disease, and again, funded through Genome Canada and CIHR. The other thing I want to mention was this PACER training program, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. I had just referred to it earlier, but this is where we train patients and they become involved in the research as researchers on the team. So we also have a socioeconomic burden of rare disease program ongoing with some things completed. That is national, but then also feeding into a European program for rare diseases called PAVE, which is building a value framework. And then very recently this year, we're thrilled, actually. This is just amazing. I'm still pinching myself. We were successful in Canada First Research Excellent Fund grant called One Child, Every Child, of which one of the main themes is precision health and getting diagnostics earlier and treatments earlier, tailored to complex chronic medical disease. So all of these interlink in different ways, but this just gives you a thumbnail of the research we're doing. No, we're not going through all of this, but don't worry. You can go to sleep soon, James. Don't worry. Okay, so my perspective on value is, yes, we do cost effectiveness analysis for sure, but a lot of what we do is beyond the traditional economic evaluation to support decision making. So we do a fair bit of personal utility and preferences research, looking at what one can call the non-health value associated with process outcomes and various features of treatment delivery. So in preferences world, we can think about this in terms of the desirable aspects of treatments or interventions and the acceptable aspects of treatments or interventions when we think about harms in that context, or when looking at desirability, we're looking at benefits. We also did this team paper with the Geeks group. You probably know Dean Regier, and Deirdre's here, of course, and James is here. And this was a paper which kind of is a nice overview, I think, of the different ways you can think of non-health benefits, thinking about economic methods like willingness to pay, thinking about how can we predict uptake of different treatments, and utility in the context of theory-based methods that reflect value beyond what might traditionally be inequality, for example. Not that those are bad, but maybe they aren't as broad as we like, especially when we think of diseases like rare diseases. There are a lot of different elements that go into just the value of knowing a diagnosis, for instance. So very briefly, patient preference information in the way that I use the word preferences, or will do so in this talk, is about these desirable or acceptable features that differ amongst different health states, interventions, or health services. And it's not patient-reported outcomes per se. Yes, they're patient-reported, but it's not patient-reported outcomes like health-related quality of life instruments. This is looking at the different features. It's also not patient experience, because it's not about satisfaction and experience, but it's about the relative desirability or acceptability. So with patient preference information, we're trying to reflect what does the patient want, not what did they experience already. Now, of course, what they experienced already might influence what they want, but they are related but separate concepts. And it's also not shared decision making per se. So shared decision making is a component of patient-centered care, and where we have a process of patients working together with their providers and their families, to make decisions. And patient preference information can support shared decision making, but it isn't shared decision making in and of itself. So sometimes these terms, they kind of get convoluted, and they're all kind of related, but they're a little bit different. So I just wanted to lay that out in the context of what I'm talking about. So why does this matter? We're thrilled. Honestly, it's almost, I guess, 8 years ago now, where agencies like the Food and Drug Administration in particular became very engaged in the whole topic of patient preferences and how do we get patient input and perspectives. About, I guess it's 20 years ago now, that they approved patient-reported outcomes as part of submissions to regulatory approvals. And in the last, as I said, 8 years or so now, they started saying, oh, maybe preferences are important too. So that we're beginning to be able to look at both outcomes measures, not only as outcome measures, but in terms of what matters to patients, as well as process measures. And you can now include this information as evidence into the FDA. So why do we care about this? Well, in the end, our bottom line has to be we want to achieve benefits that matter to patients. And patients have their own expertise, and they certainly know what they value. So in the context of precision medicine, things like time to a diagnosis is really important to parents and children with rare diseases. And knowledge about a disease has value. It may not be measurable like years of life of survival, but knowledge is of value. And so is information about one's genetic makeup and prognoses, etc. So the other thing that comes into this is that patient preferences are heterogeneous. So not everybody wants the same thing. So in order to be able to reflect that, we need to be able to measure it. So this is how I got hooked into preferences measurement because it matters, I think. And as I said, terribly exciting, but in the last 8 years or so, so within the span of my career and lifetime, FDA is now saying patient preference information is valid scientific evidence. This is massive. And for early career researchers who are maybe just starting into this was an aha eureka moment within the last 10 years that has absolutely changed the way we look at regulatory guidance, how we look at valuing different services, etc. It doesn't mean that we didn't talk to patients, we didn't get patient input, but for the FDA to say that patient preference information is valid scientific evidence is pretty monumental. So here we are, we can conduct benefit risk assessments, we can look at non-clinical, we can look at clinical investigations and patient preference studies. So this is a big deal. It has to be done with high quality. And I have, whoops, I think I skipped over that slide. Now it's coming up. And they do have criteria for this, but it nonetheless is considered evidence. So there's different kinds of patient preference information. I'm not going to go into the details, but methodologically, I mean, you can look at attributes and what matters, and you can use qualitative methods. Nothing wrong with that. They're all good. I'm a huge fan and supporter of qualitative research because we do a lot of it, as it turns out, to support our quantitative work. So you can't avoid it. Even if you're not fully a qualitative researcher, this is why you need collaborations and networks, because you need to collaborate with people to do, I think, good, high quality research. We can look at relative importance in terms of the order of what matters and use quantitative methods here around what's priority and what's important. And then on the right-hand side here, on the trade-off side, This is about more of the discrete choice experiment realm, where we're thinking about how much does it matter. So we can have methods that are quantitative, that are designed explicitly to capture trade-offs between different aspects of a treatment. So here we get into the realm of benefit risk assessment. How much time would you be willing to give up to have a higher, i.e. survival, to have a higher quality of life, for example. And using these methods, we can make estimates of that. And we can also look at preference heterogeneity to say which groups of patients value these in different ways. So one of the things I've had the privilege of doing is working with is poor. That might also be a career thing. Somehow I got rather engaged with the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research over the course of my career, and really had a fabulous opportunity to be engaged with these task force reports, which are expert good research practice reports a decade ago, looking at the applications in health using conjoint analysis or mostly discrete choice experiments. And it wasn't that this was a new method, but it hadn't been applied that much in health. So we kind of, as good health economists do, we borrow from other fields and disciplines, and we look to the psychology literature and the marketing literature and say, hey, this would be useful in healthcare. And it had been out there, but it really started taking off, I would say, about a decade ago, and it's just exploded. So we also did a task force on the experimental design, because that's quite unique in preferences research when you're doing discrete choice quantitative type studies, and the statistical methods. And the whole idea of all of this was, if we can understand what matters to patients, and you can think about the effect, you can think about what matters to them in the context of effectiveness, you could hopefully improve adherence to adoption of clinical treatments. And this is the whole premise. I mentioned the qualities for patient preferences studies. These are the 11 qualities for well-conducted, scientifically rigorous patient preferences studies that are identified in the FDA report. I won't go through them all, but there are certainly methodological considerations that are key if you want to do high-quality work in this. And the goals are really around being objective, making sure it's relevant, scientifically valid, and of course, there's feasibility. So the last and most recent task force that we did was something we called a roadmap. And the first 3 task forces we did was they were really focused on the methods, trying to create some standardization in health, some sort of guide and sort of good research practices for doing good quality, high quality preferences research, both in how you conduct it in the steps, one of which is doing really good qualitative research to inform your survey for preferences is critical, but also getting the statistical design correct and the analysis correct. But we wanted to spend time in this last one to say, well, how do we make sure we increase and maximize, I guess, the usefulness and the impact of preferences in decision making? So there are 5 different dimensions that we included in this framework. One is around, what is the context? What, who, what, where, why, and when are you making decisions? What decision making context is it? Because if you don't understand that, I guess it's kind of hard to tailor your study to have an impact. So spending the time up front to figure that out, working with patients, engaging with patient advocacy groups, if that makes sense, understanding who's going to be make the decision, etc. And that also links very closely to the purpose. So who are going to be the stakeholders? Who would be the people using your information? So you can do a high quality study, but it could have 0 impact, right? So if you're interested in the applied aspects of this and having influence per se, then you need to spend some time on number 1 and 2 here. And then the 3rd, 4th, and 5th are a little more down the road, so to speak, the population, thinking about, well, whose preferences matter, and what's appropriate, and how do you engage those people. And then the methods is already number 4. So that's already, embedded down the road, as opposed to spending the time in 1, 2, and 3. And I think this is really the emphasis of this whole task force report, is take the time up front, which unfortunately takes time, but I think is worth it, because we have a lot of different methods now that are quite well documented. There's lots of good support for executing them, and I don't think that is the lead. It has to be about what's your question. And then the 5th point is emphasizing here is, okay, you've done your study. And I think one of the self-criticisms I can make about me and many other academics is, we do our studies and we're very pleased with ourselves because we worked really hard to find the funding, execute the study, and you do your scientific papers. And more, I think the idea is spend the time to think about and disseminate and share the findings so that it can have an impact, and maybe change decision making. That's really hard, and it's usually never one single thing that does that, but trying to link it to other things and consider how to embed this in processes where it could make a difference becomes critically important. So this might seem fairly straightforward and pretty simple, but I think it's a really useful, sort of thoughtful guidance to really allow us to stop and step back and think about why we're doing the research so that we can impact. So this is an example of why would we want to do that? Well, one of the things we're working on with CADIS, which is our Canadian Agency for Health Technology Assessment, as well as the Australian agency and the UK agency, is trying to improve, using preference methods, this whole idea of patient input. So we're really fortunate in Canada that we have a nice framework. We do clinical, studies, we bring in the economics, we do budget impact, and it's required in new drug submissions. But we also have patient input. However, the patient input is mostly around what a patient views as the need for the new treatments, what their experience has been on existing drugs, what is the nature of living with that illness, etc. And we're working explicitly with Health Technology Assessment International in a working group to try to bring the idea of using preferences explicitly in the HTA process. So we're making some progress there, but it takes a long time, of course, to influence these kinds of decision processes. So now let me go through some case examples. I don't know if I should stop here, or if there are any comments or questions. If not, I'll stop there for a drink. Okay. So one of the cases, and I just wanted to highlight, is one of the first examples where patient preference information was explicitly used in a regulatory context was a study that was initiated by the FDA. And it was the first study that was explicitly designed to obtain quantitative patient preference evidence to inform a decision. And this is through the FDA. It's the Center for, oh my goodness, Devices and Radiological Health. CDRH. Sorry, I should have spelled that out. And it actually led to the approval for the first weight loss device to treat obesity. So that was pretty monumental. And there's some nice papers around this. There's a framework you can see on the bottom here about, how do you incorporate preferences into regulatory assessment and integrating the voice into medical device regulations. And I won't go into the details of this study, but they did use a discrete choice experiment. And essentially what they were able to do is look at the risk-benefit trade-offs from the patient perspective to estimate the minimum weight loss that's acceptable by a patient to receive a device with a particular profile, and a maximum mortality risk that was tolerable in exchange for a given weight loss. So that's a lot of words, but it's the maximum mortality for a given weight loss. So you have your benefit and your risk trade-off. And essentially they came up with the idea of a 0.01% mortality or risk for a 10% total body weight loss, which would last 5 years. So you have to sort of think about that. There's a lot of information in those few words. But that's a useful kind of statement, because what it tells us is that there is some threshold of acceptable mortality, which is pretty significant outcome, right? And patients are willing to do this, to accept that risk, if in fact they could have a 10% total body weight loss. So if you think about, if you reflect it onto yourself, and you think about, is it then acceptable to make this device available, and is that risk acceptable? You can then set limits for what's reasonable and what's acceptable. So this is pretty interesting, and it reminds me of a job that I had in industry, actually, when I worked for Bayer and Chiron Diagnostics, because we did the exact same thing. My internal job was basically assessing the benefits and risks of our product and whether it was going to make it to market or not. And we essentially did the same thing, because we had to say, is this going to make it with the risks associated with the product and the benefits that might be brought to bear and mixed in with the costs? And that's essentially what this allows us to think about. That's kind of neat. And then I'll just spend a little bit of time here on our precision health program. I mentioned childhood arthritis. So our overall aim in this is looking at the clinical management of childhood arthritis and creating personalized treatment pathways based on the biologic profile of the children. So every single child in this cohort is sequenced, and we have their biologic profile and an enormous, I have to say, amount of information about their quality of life, their disease activity score, their medications, costs, family spillover effects, like a lot of information. So we have that. And the whole idea is to support translational research. Yes, we're doing modeling. Yes, we're doing cost effectiveness. Yes, we're looking at preferences. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is that there is a hugely complex treatment pathways. And I know colleagues on the phone here, including our hosts, have looked at similar kinds of things, maybe not in arthritis, but you see these Sankey diagrams and you see how many changes in treatments people have. And the reason is, the sad part of the reason is that there isn't a defined clinical pathway for these patients, and we don't know who are responders or non-responders. So the current state of the nation is that it's a trial and error approach. You treat the child on one drug. You start with the lower intensity, if you will, treatments. And then if that fails, you move them up. You have to get approval in Canada anyway to move to a biologic, which is much more expensive, but it also has a lot more risks associated with it. And you see the consequence of the pathway. So this was some preliminary data. We only had 325 patients at that time, and there were 112 unique treatment sequences in these patients. So it gives you some idea of the complexity and why having biologic-based treatment pathways would be a really good thing to improve outcomes, because some people simply don't respond, and it takes years to get them to the right treatment. So we're also doing preferences, particularly around the idea of tapering to begin with. And the reason why this is relevant is biologics are very expensive. They have a lot of serious negative side effects. And we're talking about children. So nobody is very keen in putting children on a biologic treatment potentially for life. So what we're trying to do is discover if in fact there are subgroups of patients where we could taper after being treated and actually stop treatment. So this is really important, and we're looking at both the research from the rheumatologist perspective of how would you choose a child in the absence of biologic information right now. Once we have our biologic information all analyzed, we'll do it based on the biologics as well, on the biology rather, the child, i.e. their genome. But right now we have to figure out how is it done. And we've done something, and then we're also going to look at the risk-benefit trade-offs with a discrete choice experiment with the children. So that's in development, and the parents as well. But we've worked with our patient and community engagement research program trainees. So we had a group of youths. They aren't quite children. That's why I was hesitating. They're children. They're youths. They're about 17 to 25 years old. They went through our training program and looked at the impact of JAI and what we should highlight in terms of supporting patients. And they published a paper around this and looked at, the mental health aspects, the supports that are required, the different experiences and the disparities. So this work in working with our patients is also feeding into this preferences. So they've made recommendations actually about transitions in care. And now we're moving forward to doing a patient preferences study designed with our patients, looking at the benefits of tapering and the risks of tapering. So part of this is because we want to embed this into clinical guidelines. So this is the link. The idea here is that, depending on what your risk is and depending on what your clinical circumstances are and what your experiences are, you may choose different ways of approaching treatment. And that's the thinking we have around our tapering program in childhood arthritis. So to look at the rheumatologist's preferences, we used a best worst scaling methodology. And this is the publication that's being produced looking at the importance of patient and contextual factors about deciding around withdrawal of biologics. So you can see the most important factors were how challenging it is to achieve remission, which makes sense, history of the joint damage, and the time that was spent in remission. But you can also see here the patient and parent willingness to stop are also important factors that come into this decision. So we're also going to analyze that using the patient preferences study. And then I just wanted to highlight again this idea that there's heterogeneity around these different groups. And we also did a special interest group paper around preference heterogeneity and how it tapers. So we are expecting to find, these are not our results, this is in adult rheumatology, some other work that we've been involved in. But looking at heterogeneity, we are going to expect to see different phenotypes of children with juvenile idiopathic arthritis and feed that basically into our analysis of who should be tapered or not. And then this will feed into our decision model, which is it's a simulation model looking at taking the data from our study, which will create a predictive algorithm in a prediction model and identify who should be treated with which intervention first. So that's where that fits. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to case 4 and just mention the value of diagnostic and testing information, thinking about where there's clinically actionable or non-actionable information from diagnostic testing, and what's the value of that information. There have been a number of different studies around this. And one of the things we've done in rare disease, looking at whole exome sequencing, and I know several of my colleagues have looked at similar things, we were able to use a contingent valuation methodology to look at willingness to pay as a proxy, essentially, for value. And what we found when we did this, this was a discrete choice experiment as well. We found that parents were willing to pay about 6,000 Canadian dollars and willing to wait 5.2 years to get exome sequencing or any kind of genetic testing rather than having the usual care process. So it tells you that there's an association with having whole exome sequencing, getting the information, and using genetic approaches to the diagnostics rather than the usual testing sequences. We also looked at a contingent valuation here around the value of actionable and non-actionable information. And this study was kind of neat simply because it gave us some quantitative estimates about the fact that, to be expected, actionable information is more valued, non-actionable information is less valued, but actually some people actually don't value having the information at all. So what it does is highlight the fact that just getting more information isn't always of value to everybody. And there is heterogeneity in preferences, and that we should be thinking about these heterogeneous preferences when we're developing policies for return of information and in shared decision-making contexts. And I'll just finish off with our European Joint Rare Diseases Program. So all of this is feeding into something we've called PAVE, which is producing a value framework with economic evidence in childhood rare diseases. We're using juvenile arthritis as an example. It's a multi-country international study looking at these complementary aspects of value, including preferences, including equity, and including mental health, since this has been highlighted previously, to bring it into a value framework. And this is being co-designed with patients and families to try to give meaningful and also feasible implementation strategies for rare disease. And we have multiple patient advocacy organizations working with us to co-build this framework. And I'll just wrap up with our World Economic Forum paper, which by coincidence, Elias mentioned at the very beginning. And I think this just leads us to thinking about these broader value perspectives, where we can think, in this case, we were looking at the benefits of data sharing, but we applied an economics value framework. And we're looking at the diagnostic benefit, the clinical benefit, the benefit of being able to be linked into trials, and the personal value benefits. So we can think about these non-health, well, health and non-health benefits that can be measured with preferences. So I think this is kind of the whole aspect. And just to close, I'll say that I really think preferences are important in trying to understand the whole value proposition beyond our traditional economic measures. And I think we need to think about these in prioritizing, valuing, and treatment decisions. So that's hopefully gives you a little nutshell of some of the things we're doing and maybe gives you some ideas about some research ideas for applying in your context. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. That was fascinating. Fascinating to hear the relevance and application, and thanks also for touching on the decision makers aspect as well, because I think that's very much needed. I will open up the sort of discussion, maybe so the members of our SIG can ask questions to Deborah. Please raise your hand if you have a question, so I can invite you. In the meantime, Deborah, can I clarify? So we heard a lot about sort of preferences, patient preferences. Do these patient preferences also include the public, or like prospective sort of patients and users of the system, of the health system?
Yeah, no, that's
like
great.
integrate with patient and public preferences.
Absolutely. So often, because there are only so many words, I often use patient preferences because we're so used to saying patient preferences. But typically in these studies and in the studies I was describing, we would look at patient preferences. We'd also look at provider preferences where relevant, as well as public, or sometimes we call it GEM-POP, general population or families, caregivers' preferences as well. So absolutely, totally agree with you. All the comments are still applicable to all of those viewpoints.
Thank you, Deborah. Didi?
Sure. Just while we're waiting for others to chime in, I thought I'd offer out a question. So, Deborah, thank you so much for the great talk. It sounds like a lot of important work, and I really appreciate your emphasis on the importance of disseminating our work too, to be able to have that impact on decision making. What came to mind throughout all of the projects, the case studies you're talking about, was the idea that when we're using patient preference elicitation to inform decision making, it's so critical that we have diverse representation of different patient public groups in our data, in our partnership. And so I'm curious, from your experience, what recruitment steps you've taken in the past to help ensure diversity in participation, what has worked well, what hasn't worked.
Oh, that's such a good question. I think every single project we have this conversation. And we've tried a lot of different things. So one is using a variety of recruitment methods. In the end, especially, for better or worse with COVID, it's kind of opened up some options actually. And we virtually always now use in addition to clinical kind of based recruitment, we also use virtual options. Like, years ago, believe it or not, we used to use pen and paper surveys in clinic. I know that sounds foreign to some of you on this call because maybe you haven't been researching that long, but we used to use pen and paper. Well, now we use electronic. We also offer pen and paper typically, for some patients, believe it or not, depending on your demographic, that is the preferred mode. We also offer phoning them and talking them through it, so interview assisted methods can also be good. We also work really closely with patient advocacy organizations, and they have amazing networks. And with, again, social media slash internet capabilities, it does allow us, I think, a bit at least, to address some of the access issues. You can have interviews with people anywhere in the world, right? Now, as opposed to having to get them together in a focus group. So I think it's just trying to be creative and inclusive of lots of different methods. Having said that, I would urge people to be really cautious. We've had some experiences where you realize you can't count your denominator because it's being sent out. You have to be careful with social media, because if you send it out and then you don't know to how many people it's been sent out, and you don't know if you're getting duplicates. Not that I think a lot of people would want to do a survey twice, but if there's an incentive associated with it, it happens. And the other thing that's been happening extensively recently is the bot invasion problem. And you have to be very careful about setting up your surveys with incentives to make sure and screen for bots. We're getting a lot of fraudulent data responses, and we need to screen out for those. So yes, it's good to be, try to reach out and use a lot of different mechanisms, which we try to do to get the diversity. But gee, also be very cognizant of who you're sending it to and how, and being able to screen those responses.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Probably one last sort of question. I haven't seen any questions online or on the chat. But sort of understanding that the research sort of funding is limited, and sort of we need to do also, as you said, have diverse sort of representation. I guess, how does this sort of change the research process, and how can we optimize that process to ensure that we provide the best outcomes possible?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's always a challenge, because there's also resources, there's money, but there's also time. as a health economics group, people appreciate the value of time, right? Typically, what we try to do actually is partner with different organizations and kind of leverage, as I say, patient advocacy groups or different disease type organizations who might be able to help. Because it really is very resource intensive to recruit through clinics, and the reach isn't as large. So I don't know if there's an exact answer to that, but it's about balancing it. And every project is a little different depending on what resources you have available. So yeah, I don't know if there's a good answer to that. Perhaps you have some suggestions of how you've done that, but for us, it's just balancing depending on what resources you have.
Thank you, Deborah. Adam, yeah, that's the last question to Deborah. You're muted. You're on mute, Adam.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Deborah, for the presentation. I'm curious about the impact of infodemics when you are measuring patient preference. I'm not sure in Canada, in United States, in the South where I am, there are folks who believe COVID-19 vaccine is nanobots. Federal government is injecting into people's bodies. If you receive a response, maybe close to that, I'm curious how that how we can handle this type of response, and how patient estimation can be adjusted, or should we include that in the estimation as well?
Yeah, I think if I'm following your question right, thank you for raising that. I think the idea is in all of our preferences surveys, it's not just about the preferences. Actually, there's a fair bit of developmental work that needs to be done, both in terms of getting your basic demographic information, but also, I'm going to say, experience variables. And also behavioral type variables. So when we've done some research in the COVID kind of world or endemic pandemics where there may be some strong opinions, if you will, about particular intervention, we've usually included a fairly extensive component of the survey that reflects somebody's viewpoint. So even, for example, you mentioned you're in the South. In surveys that we've done in COVID, we would typically include their political, actually, perspectives, and also their risk aversion perspectives and their viewpoints around vaccines. All of those things, knowing that that probably will have quite a large influence on their preferences and their choices. And then we would try to include that in the analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. So before we close, we wanted to let our members know about sort of a call that has been sort of advertised by the sort of Applied Health Economics and Health Policy Journal. It's a call for papers on the health economics of genomic technologies. The call is guest edited by James Buchanan, Deirdre Wayman, and myself. So if you have a paper that you would like to be as part of this theme, please send us an abstract by the end of the year. We'll invite the papers by end of January, and then we would expect the papers back to us by end of May. A final sort of note that the IHEA World Congress in 2025 will be held in Calgary in Canada, and Deborah will be our host. Deborah, you want to comment on that quickly?
Oh yeah, thank you. I have my mascot here. This is the horse mascot. Except we don't know that it's a mascot yet. But it's July 19 to 23. So we're having it here in Calgary. I'm co-hosting this with Aidan Hollis, whom you probably know, who is an economist. here in Calgary. And we're quite thrilled about it, actually, and really hope that we'll get a good showing and some good opportunities, I think, around genomics as well. And I hope we have a workshop around genomics and personalized medicine, so as well as a whole program. So thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. My daughter would love to have that sort of horse.
Oh, this
thank you
one in
for-
particular?
Well, one of those, when we come.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you in the first sort of economics talk. There will be many of those coming up in the new year. So thanks very much, everyone.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Deborah.